It's been over 2 weeks since the results of the Belarusian presidential elections were announced. For those 2 weeks, media have reported numerous cases of protesters being threatened, kidnapped, and beaten by the representatives of the Belarusian security forces. In the meantime, the ongoing crisis has steadily gained attention from the international community, not only thanks to the protesters' actions and the neighboring countries' calls for peace and de-escalation, but also because of Lukashenko's very own statements about the external meddling in the Belarus crisis. At the same time, he sought for Russian support in his continuing efforts to stay in power. My today's guest is Pavel Havlicek, analyst in the Czech think tank AMO and Rethink fellow in Brussels office of German Marshall Fund. Being an expert on Eastern Europe, Pavel is a frequent commentator on the Belarus crisis in the Czech media. Pavel, huge thanks for accepting the invitation, as I know that you are quite busy these days. I decided to conduct this interview with you also because, apart from your great expertise, you are not a Polish expert. And I guess it is highly appreciated that the Polish audience understands the broader context of Belarusian elections. And that's where I'd like to put stress on in our discussion, the external actors. So let's start with the European Union. Its leaders expressed the view that Belarus crisis doesn't seem to be geopolitical. Pavel, that's an opinion or a wish? Is the European Union ready for a post-Lukashenko Belarus?
Thank you so much, Bartek, for this question and for inviting me for this discussion. This is indeed an excellent question, and at the first place, I consider that to be a bit of wish, because honestly, if we have a look at the whole situation from a Belarusian perspective, and this is the most important to all of us, I believe, we have to say that basically the Belarusian themselves at the first place, they are praying for not making that geopolitical, because obviously their country is somehow squeezed between the two integrational projects, meaning the EU and also the Eurasian Economic Union, but also somehow in between two big great powers, so to say, the EU and Russia itself. So obviously, while Belarus is much closer to Russia, also being part of some of the integrational initiatives and also obviously having that kind of cooperation with Russia also in the military realm, for the ordinary Belarusians, this is of a secondary importance. If you have a look at all the basically research polls and independent pollings, you will find out that ordinary Belarusians, they don't want to go to the EU. They don't want to go to Russia and have a union state with the Russian Federation, but they want to have their own independent state. They want to have a sovereign and territorially integrated Belarus without any kind of foreign power interfering in their domestic affairs. And from that point of view, obviously, that perspective and voice that is coming from the EU is very much matching the local needs and local kind of demands, I would say. So obviously, while the geopolitical component is largely discussed and is the elephant in the room, from my point of view, it is still a wish and strong preference from the local citizens to be so. For example, as many of the analysts and external observers are kind of matching and comparing, so to say, the Armenian situation with the Belarusian one, especially in the essence of not making this geopolitical. Even if you ask me, the Belarusian scenario for Belarus is not feasible, simply because Belarus is directly a neighboring NATO members, meaning the Baltic states and Poland, obviously, but it is also so much closely interconnected and in terms of ideologically so much intertwined with the Russian kind of domestic landscape, much more than far away Armenia.
Well, in fact, some of the experts even underlined that there is a lack of anti-Russian slogans at protests in Belarus. So therefore, the protesters themselves believe that it's rather the internal functioning of their state than geopolitics that ignited the crisis. But turning back to the second component of my question, do you believe that the EU has a concept of how Belarus could look like without Lukashenko?
Thank you so much, Bartek. Sorry for escaping you from that question originally. I will come back to that in the second part of the answer. But obviously, if we have a look at the if we have a look at the situation in EU-Belarusian relations now, we can see that obviously EU is on the weaker side when you compare that with the Russian influence in Belarus. Obviously, it is the whole economic cooperation. It is so many other levels. I have hinted on the military cooperation and common exercises, such as Zapad, the yearly exercise, basically against. So to say, Baltic countries, Poland, and the whole of NATO surrounding both of the countries. So there are so many dimensions to the mutual cooperation between Russia and Belarus. And in that regard, the EU is only playing the weaker end, unfortunately, from our perspective. But if we go to the question of if EU is ready for post-Lukashenko Belarus and how that would look like, this is a much more interesting question, because obviously this is something that has been debated, also within the Eastern Partnership framework. Belarus is part of that since 2009, and it is to a certain level Europeanized in the kind of along the lines of the goals of the Eastern Partnership, but it is only limited. It is only a limited extent to which this has happened. Obviously, at the first place, the local elites and the Lukashenko regime has done the job, and they have determined how close Belarus would come to the EU, and basically they have decided not to integrate. They have decided not to have the association agreement and the DCFTA, as is the case in Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. So the current elites in Belarus, they have decided that they will keep the distance, and this has been very much respected from the side of the EU. And for that reason, I would also say that the EU is not so much ready actually for post-Lukashenko Belarus and how they would tackle the whole situation. Just because, as I mentioned, Belarus is so closely intertwined and interconnected with the Russian domestic politics, there is the state union that has been in making since 1999, and over the last 2 years, basically speeding, the Russian authorities has been putting pressure on promoting this kind of integration beyond the economic level. They want to have political union. They want to have effectively so-called federation, but de facto this would mean ceasing of the Belarusian independent states and sovereign country as it is now, as Belarus is now. So we have to be very careful. By that, I will come back also to the question of the anti-Russian sentiments and what has some called as such, especially by Lukashenko himself, but also this has been echoed by Russian propaganda and the state media to some extent. Even if I would argue that Russia itself has at least a dual-track policy and diplomacy on Belarus now, because Russia itself, it's not determined and there is no clear Belarus policy at this stage. Russia is basically waiting what will, it is wait-and-see game that they are playing, as I would see.
That was actually something I was about to jump into, the scenarios of Russia's response to the crisis. So in the Eastern Europe, we always fear the military intervention as a Russian way of restoring the status quo. Do you believe that's the case here? And Pavel, is actually protecting Lukashenko really in Russia's ultimate interest at this point? Would they be ready to accept someone instead of Lukashenko?
Excellent questions. Once again, I would say that the original goals from before 9th of August, when the whole protest movement has actually started and reached such unprecedented levels that both surprised the Belarusian domestic authorities, but also Russia itself, was to have a weak but still in place Lukashenko's regime and the Belarusian president staying in power, no matter what it takes. I would say that this was the original position and this was the original policy to weaken Lukashenko. And there was actually, when I was speaking about this dual track diplomacy, what I had in mind was that, for example, Russian president was, well, second in a row after the Chinese one, but he congratulated Lukashenko relatively early on. But at the same time, from the Russian State Duma, the lower chamber of the Russian parliament, you heard voices actually questioning the results, pointing to mass falsification and creatively playing with the final figures and so on and so forth, just basically to exercise pressure on Lukashenko himself and to question his legitimacy, which is in fact in the Russian interest, as I would argue, for this further integration and putting basically Lukashenko where Russians need. But at the same time, I would say that Russia is also only partially ready at this stage for post-Lukashenko regime and whatever it is is to happen in Belarus itself, just because they have known him for so long. They know what to expect from him. He is a difficult partner. He has opposed their interest for years. And I've already spoken about this political integration, but it is also numerous issues and bilateral disputes on energy. It is also on somehow, security matters. When Russia wanted to install its military base in Belarus and Lukashenko was against, and so on and so forth. The list of the undecided disputes is really, really quite long. But at the same time, they know what to expect from him. And there is another added value for Russia if Lukashenko stays in power. And this is basically not to allow another so-called color revolution happening just next door. Obviously, this is a big fear in Russia, that these protests, and they are very closely watched in Russia, obviously we shouldn't be forgetting what is happening in the far east of Russia, in Khabarovsk, that a similar protest movement is taking place in there. It is very far, but at the same time, you can see to a certain level through digital technologies, some connections and actually, shared spirits against the autocratic regime and rules, and falsification of elections, because this is exactly what happened just on the 1st of July when the all Russia voting was happening. And which effectively allowed Putin to stay in power until 2036. So exactly the same scenario of authoritarian leader manipulating with people's will for his own domestic and private interest. This is a very close parallel, which everybody in both Russia and Belarus is understanding. So obviously, from that perspective, Russia prefers Lukashenko to stay. But, and this I will end on, they are also aware that Lukashenko over the last 2 weeks, more than 2 weeks, became a toxic person. He is toxic now to the Belarusian domestic audience, he is toxic to the Western audience and the whole of EU that didn't recognize the results, but also he's toxic to many in Russia, including the Russian leadership, and the personal lack of chemistry, I will call that, between Putin and Lukashenko is a well-known fact as well. So they are playing for time as well, as I mentioned, and they are also flirting with the idea who could be the one replacing Lukashenko. And for example, there were already calls and some people somehow saying that, for example, the widely popular banker and a person who has very close ties to Russia, Viktor Babarika, could be the one person that Russia could have imagined in the seat of the next Belarusian president. But obviously, he's still sitting in jail. So this is again complicating the Russian interest in here.
So 2 follow-up questions. As in every single dictatorship, the change comes when the inner circles start flowing. Do you believe that in Belarus, the inner circles are eager to change their, let's say, master? And secondly, you said that Russians weren't prepared for what happened just after the elections. If you could explain the story behind the capturing of Wagner Group, orchestrated by Lukashenko, was it a kind of a Russian influence that Lukashenko wanted to prevent?
Yes, so I will start with the second question, because this is quite closely connected to Russia again, that we ended in the previous question. So basically, the whole affair with the Wagner mercenaries was something, again, quite closely connected to the Belarusian-Russian bilateral relations. The same as arresting Viktor Babarika, the former head of the Belgazprom Bank, the daughter company of the bank, Gazprom Bank, basically. So the two affairs, just most recently, actually really still stirred the waters in the Belarusian-Russian relations. And when it comes to the later one, when it comes to the Wagner army, I would say that this was again yet another surprise to Mr. Putin, who was operating and who was basically, together with his inner circle, having this kind of scheme of having Minsk as a transport hub for these mercenaries throughout the world, and we know that they are very closely operating not only in the east of Ukraine, but they are also operating all across the MENA region, in Syria, in Central Africa, elsewhere in African continent, and so on and so forth. So they were basically using Minsk, which was much more open throughout the COVID pandemic period, as a transport hub. And Lukashenko, as I believe, simply decided to escalate the whole situation. He exposed the whole scheme that was operating for quite some time, several months at least, and was basically in order to put himself back in the center of attention when he had around him Mrs. Tikhanovska organizing dozens and hundreds of thousands of people all across the country in her support. And obviously, Lukashenko has played on the card of stability and security, and him being the main guarantor of that sort of kind of interest in that is concerning everyone in Belarus. He has played on that card, and exposing that scheme of Wagner's mercenaries was an attempt to go back to the center of attention. Obviously, he could have exercised much more pressure on the opposition. He only partially connected the leaders of opposition, Sergei Tikhanovsky and also Mykola Statkevich, with the mercenaries, and obviously their attempt to so-called overthrow the Lukashenko regime, as he spoke about that very early on. But he also basically, as I believe, he backed off. He withdrew from that rhetoric after the Russian pressure, as I see it, because at the first place, he really had a very strong wording and a very strong vocabulary when referring to the Wagner's army. And he even hesitated with the idea of handling them to Ukraine. But after all, he said that they were innocent, that this was a plot, basically all orchestrated by the Ukrainian secret services, SBU, and so on and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So he decided not to escalate. But to come back to the issue of inner circle. Inner circle, yes, this is a very important one, because obviously we have seen somehow a fragmentation within the people from his inner circle, including the diplomatic apparatus. And you might have heard about the Belarusian ambassador to Slovakia, who decided to side with protest. You might have heard about the former Minister of Culture, who decided to side with the protest and is now part of the Coordination Council. Actually, you might have heard about single individuals, but also dozens of people from inside of the Belarusian propaganda apparatus and the state TV, who decided to first go on strike and then finally handle their resignations, just in order to protest against the brutality of the Belarusian regime, and so on and so forth. But in fact, as I see it, and this is the case until now, these were rather single individuals and not mass scale, basically switching of sides, so to say. But at the same time, this is not to say that these discussions and second thoughts are not happening also within the so-called Siloviki circles, the power structures, mm-hmm. in the police, but also in the OMON anti-crisis units, in KGB, and also most importantly in the Belarusian army, which has obviously very strong Russian ties, as I've spoken about them. So there are discussions happening, there are second thoughts as well, but we have not seen on a mass scale people from the security apparatus siding with the opposition, joining their ranks and going against their own master, just because they still might be clinging on what might be the more secure vector at this stage, just because they realize all the power that that Lukashenko still has under the roof, actually. And this is obviously also consisting of their own kind of personal contributions. And we have seen that just yesterday when Belarusian president was almost actually fighting literally with his people using guns and army and militarized police units. And the clash was very, very close. So we really need to be observing that carefully. But until this point, I would not say that we have seen any kind of switching sides on a mass scale.
So the question about the V4 activity in the crisis. Although both Poland and Czech Republic were accused of meddling in Belarus, it is predominantly Lithuania that has taken the role of supporter of protesters abroad. In the meantime, Polish media quoted the opinion that our government is unable to shape the European response to the crisis in Belarus because of the lack of the credibility when it comes to democracy and the rule of law. Yet Lukashenko uses Polish threat to the Belarusian sovereignty as one of the key issues to mobilize his supporters. To what extent Poland, Czech Republic, and the V4 as such may play an active role in the crisis? And Pavel, secondly, is it actually in the interest of the V4 at this point to choose the anti-Lukashenko position?
Thank you. I would say that, first of all, the V4 role so far has been rather constructive, rather important and influential on the European scale, and also rather positive at the same time. Because when you followed actually the flow of events, first we saw the informal summit of foreign ministers just 2 weeks ago on Friday, actually, and already some hints of possible sanctions, siding with the opposition, not recognizing the flawed results, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it was the Polish Prime Minister Morawiecki was the first one to echo that. Actually, he wanted to initiate a high-level, virtual discussion of EU leaders. And this was later on endorsed by the Czech Prime Minister, Andrej Babiš, who, to some surprisingly, really appeared to be in the core of a very strong and heavy-handed response to the Belarusian crisis. So he was the one saying, look, we can't allow another 1968 happening in Belarus. Also, obviously, hinting on the Russian influence and involvement in here. We should be following the Velvet results and the Velvet Revolution of 1989. He was also saying very strongly. He was saying he even met with Belarusian immigration in Czechia. He said we will provide help to the demonstrants and so on and so forth. So both, I would say, Poland, that also presented its own vision for extending the Kalinowski program for students and academicians fired and basically under repression, easing the migration cooperation and easing of access for Belarusians, especially who were repressed by the regime, and so on and so forth, presenting again a number of concrete measures. So the V4 response, I would say, was rather constructive and rather influential on the EU level. Obviously, we shouldn't be also forgetting of what I would also call a success of the Polish diplomacy when pushing for a common statement on the V4 level by the heads of states. All the four presidents issued relatively strong, relatively obviously still wrapped in diplomatic language, but a relatively strong message to Belarus, including Mr. Zeman, who is famous for siding with the Russian narratives and Russian side of things. But also, obviously, his Hungarian counterpart. So putting the four countries that had originally very different positions on Belarus together, I consider a success of the Polish diplomacy. So this is just to start on the V4 level. At the same time, obviously, the response to the events was and could be only somehow limited. Once again, just because Russia is so much better placed in interfering and basically engaging in domestically in Belarus, and there is only so much the EU, but also the V4, as you know, Poland itself, at least a neighboring country, can be providing. And obviously this has this provides a very good opportunity to the Baltic countries that are very closely connected to Belarus as well. They have hosted as well as Poland and its Belsat and other institutions Belarusian emigration in the past, Belarusian independent media, but most recently, obviously, also Sviatlana Tikhanovska, who has been hosted by the Lithuanian Foreign Ministry and has met the Prime Minister and also the President of Lithuania. So the links and connections to the Baltic countries are very, very obvious, and they are very closely in the picture. And we have seen some of the proposals also to mediate in between the citizens and the regime coming from Lithuania, but also Poland and Nordic countries, and expression of their interest to be so. But I will also I will end on another note. You asked me also if this is of interest to the V4, if we basically not only not recognize, but if we lose Lukashenko as a president of Belarus. And I will say honestly that the whole situation is rather complicated for us, because we don't want to have another Crimea. We don't want to have another Donbass just across our border. And once again, Poland is neighboring Belarus, so it is directly facing the problems. So we, and this is not to our interest to have another point of instability, and neither it is to have another kind of a part of the territory annexed by Russia, as we have seen in the past in Ukraine or Georgia, in fact. So we have to be very, very careful to balance. We want to endorse our own values, we want to push for them, and yes, what you mentioned related to Poland and harming its credibility when it comes to the rule of law, especially in the European debate, this is true. But at the same time, all of the V4 countries are now somehow exercising and implementing these values in practice when refusing the dictator basically repressing its own citizens. So by that, we can also be improving our own reputation in Europe when basically pushing for all of these very important European values and their practical kind of elaboration in Belarus.
As we're running out of time, a conclusion comes to my mind, that although the current crisis may not be a geopolitical event, its results will clearly be, as much for Russia as for the rest of the region. Thank you very much, Pavel, for this delightful discussion, and I really hope to continue it next time, maybe with some focus on the US actions during this crisis.
Thank you so much.